Thank you very much. The theme of today's talk is LGBT plus rights. What next? That question is a very good one because we have made enormous gains over the last 2 decades. If you think about it, until 1999, Britain had by volume the largest number of anti-LGBT laws of any country in the world. Some of those laws dated back centuries. Yet here we are, less than 2 decades later, and we have some of the world's best laws for LGBT plus people. So that's been a phenomenally successful campaign, due in large part to the efforts of LGBT plus people themselves, but also thankfully to our straight friends and allies who have campaigned with us to help ensure that LGBT plus people today in Britain have equal rights in law and that we have greater public understanding and acceptance. So I'm very, very proud and honoured to be part of this movement, and I'm very gratified that we have made these positive changes, and it shows that change is possible. You know, when we began way back decades ago, it seemed that LGBT equality was just an impossible dream because no government was willing to legislate equality. Every government, both Labour and Conservative, supported discrimination. But we persevered, and it shows that with perseverance, we can make a difference. You can make a difference. It is possible to change things. So let's take a journey backwards. In 1999, the first significant LGBT law reform was the ending of the ban on LGBT plus people in the armed forces. Up until that point, gay people, lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender people could be sacked from the armed forces simply because of their sexuality. So 1999 was the year in which that prohibition ended. So the armed forces became open to LGBT plus people. Then soon afterwards we had an equalisation of the age of consent, whereas, you know, for over a century the age of consent had been 16 for sexual acts between men and women. In 1967, when there was a partial decriminalisation of male homosexuality, the age of consent was set at 21 for gay and bisexual men. Then it was reduced in 1994 to 18, and finally in 2001 to 16 for everyone. And since that time we've had so many other changes: an end to the ban on same-sex couples fostering and adopting children, the legislation of protection against discrimination in the workplace, housing, education, and so on. The enactment first of civil partnerships, then of same-sex marriage, the repeal of Section 28, which banned the promotion, or so-called promotion, of homosexuality by local authorities, including schools. We also had, very importantly, the right of same-sex couples to not only foster and adopt children, but also to be able to have those adoptions and fosterings recognised in law, so that LGBT or same-sex parenting became legal. And we also saw a whole host of other smaller changes which have greatly extended the rights and freedoms of LGBT plus people, and it's all within the space of less than 2 decades. But there are still issues to resolve. We have made great progress, but more still needs to be done. For a start, we know that 45% of LGBT plus pupils in schools say that they've been bullied because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. 45%. And only about half of all schools have an active campaign against homophobic, biphobic, and transphobic bullying. So that's a really big issue, because that bullying does result in many LGBT plus pupils feeling isolated, rejected, ostracized, but also in fear. In fear because in some instances, this bullying involves threats, menaces, and actual physical violence. So no child, no pupil, no student should have to put up with that. And then if we look at the situation on the street, we find that even today, 40% of all LGBT people in this country, well over 500,000, say that they have personally been a victim of anti-LGBT hate crime, which could involve just teasing and name-calling, but also threats, menaces, harassment, and again, even actual physical violence. And many of these people, particularly of an older generation, say that they've experienced this kind of hate crime not once or twice, but 3, 4, and 5 times over their life. You will know that in 2004, the government finally agreed to recognize transgender people. It passed the Gender Recognition Act, which allowed trans people to legally change their gender. But progress though that was, that process was full of all kinds of obstacles and difficulties. So they had to live in their chosen gender for at least 2 years. They had to get a medical authorization and approval. There was a whole host of things that had to be done, which made it difficult. So one of the new big reforms we're seeking is to ensure that trans people are able to self-declare. That they shouldn't be contingent on medical authorization and approval, that they should be able to sign a statutory declaration to change their gender by law, similar to the kind of more liberal progressive legislation that exists on trans issues in Ireland and Malta. When it comes to sex and relationship education in schools, still most schools do not address LGBT plus issues. Some do, but most don't. And often when they do address the issue, it's in a superficial, almost dismissive way. You know, there may be a few words said about it, but no real clear, coherent support for LGBT plus pupils, and no clear challenge to the prejudice that some straight kids express. We know that it's very important that all young people, whatever their sexual orientation or gender identity, have good quality relationship and sex education. Education around safer sex to prevent the transmission of HIV and other sexually transmitted infections. Education around conception to prevent unwanted pregnancies. Education around issues of emotions and feelings, which are singularly lacking in most schools these days. A lot of the sex education is very biological, very much about the process of reproduction. But we know from young people's own feelings and expressed views that they want to know about feelings, emotions, relationships. They want to get advice on how to deal with problems in a relationship. You know, what do you do if your partner refuses to wear a condom? All these kinds of issues most schools still don't address, nor do they adequately address the issue of abusive relationships, whether that be emotional abuse or sexual abuse. So those are issues that still need to be addressed. We also know that for many, many young people and older people, there are still issues around coming out, that many people don't feel safe to come out because perhaps their family or culture or religious background is very strongly anti-LGBT. And those kids are much more likely to suffer depression, anxiety, perhaps to self-harm or have suicidal thoughts. So we need to help educate parents as well as young people about LGBT issues, so that parents with LGBT plus kids can be understanding and accepting, so that they can be able to embrace their sons and daughters who are LGBT. Another issue is the plight of LGBT plus refugees who flee persecution in violently homophobic countries like Saudi Arabia, Russia, Iran, Uganda, Nigeria, Jamaica. People in these countries are often at risk of imprisonment, possibly even torture, and in some instances, honor killing and mob violence. So they come here to seek a place of refuge. And Britain has signed the Refugee Convention. We've promised to give people with a well-founded fear of persecution a safe haven. But the rate of rejection for LGBT plus refugees is much higher than for political, ethnic, or religious refugees. So there's a bias there in the way in which the asylum system treats LGBT plus refugees, and that needs to change. We have to end the culture of disbelief and the very onerous burden of proof that is placed upon LGBT people seeking asylum. You may know that until a few years ago, there was a lifetime ban on gay and bisexual men who'd ever had oral sex or anal sex from donating blood. They could not ever donate blood if they had oral or anal sex, even just once, even before the beginning of the HIV pandemic, even if they used a condom. Now, some years ago, that was changed to a 12-month deferral period. In other words, the blood service says, well, you can donate blood, not freely, but if you've abstained from oral or anal sex for at least 12 months, then you can donate blood. So, of course, most gay and bisexual men don't abstain from sex for 12 months. That didn't really help. This was reduced to 3 months more recently, but even that is not necessary, because of course there are some gay and bisexual men who maybe have HIV or risk of HIV, and they should not donate blood. But there's lots of gay and bisexual men who always practice safer sex. Perhaps they're in a long-term monogamous relationship, they've tested HIV negative, they've used the condom correctly without any breakages. The idea that they should abstain from donating blood for 3 months since their last sexual experience doesn't make sense. So my foundation is pressing the blood transfusion service to lift the blanket 3-month ban and to individually assess each donor. And all this requires is a few extra questions to gay and bisexual men who want to donate blood about their sexual history, about their risk factors, to eliminate those with risky past behavior, but to also identify those who are not at risk and who therefore can donate blood. And that is in the interests of the blood service. As you know, there's always a need for more blood donations. So excluding people without good cause, without justification, doesn't make sense. It deprives patients in need of the blood they require to save their lives. Another issue is, of course, the way in which something like 100,000 gay and bisexual men were convicted of consenting adult same-sex behavior under anti-gay laws that dated back, in one case, to the 1500s. The law against anal sex was promulgated in 1533 during the reign of King Henry VIII, and it stipulated the death penalty for same-sex relations. In 1861, the death sentence was commuted to life imprisonment, and it remained punishable by life imprisonment until 1967, when the partial law reform in England and Wales reduced the maximum penalty to 2 to 5 years. But now, quite clearly, those laws are history. The laws may be history, but the suffering they caused is not. So there are many thousands of gay and bisexual men who were convicted under those historic anti-gay laws, who suffered the stigma and shame of a criminal conviction, often a substantial fine, in some cases imprisonment, and often very bad ill treatment, brutal treatment from other inmates while in jail. We're saying that those men deserve compensation, that they were convicted under unjust, homophobic, discriminatory laws, that where they suffered, they should get compensation. We're not talking about hundreds of thousands of pounds or millions. We're talking about some reasonable compensation for their suffering, whether that be in terms of having to pay a large fine, serving time in prison. But of course, there were also the knock-on effects. So I'll give you an example. Stephen Close was a soldier in the army. At the age of 19, in 1982, he was convicted for consenting sex with another soldier of a similar age. He was sentenced to 6 months in Colchester military prison, which is a very, very harsh prison regime. It's a military prison. When he got out, he was given a dishonorable discharge with disgrace. So whenever he sought to apply for a job and had to provide a reference from the army, no employer would touch him because he had a dishonorable discharge with disgrace. And for 30 years, he battled to get a decent job and couldn't get one. Either he was unemployed or did low-paid menial jobs. So he suffered incredibly much over a 3-decade period. There's also the issue of who is out and who isn't. So more and more people are coming out, but there are certain aspects of British life where very few people have come out. So although there are some top CEOs of major FTSE 100 companies who have come out, most are still in the closet. When it comes to sport, male tennis, boxing, athletics and swimming, there are hardly any top-ranking British sports stars who are out. And in our Premier Division football, although there are 5,000 professional players in this country, which on the statistical average would mean that roughly 500 of them are probably gay or bisexual, not a single one is out. Not even one. Now the question is, why not? What is it about the mental attitude, the peer pressure, and so on, that leads those players not to come out? In women's tennis, quite a few prominent players have come out. But in men's tennis, I can't think of a single top-ranked male player who's been open about his sexuality. Also, of course, the response and support for LGBT people in different communities varies. So we know that in the Muslim community, in parts of the African and Afro-Caribbean communities, there are very strong anti-LGBT attitudes, and that the rates of parental rejection, the rate of threats and harassment from family members is much higher in those communities than the average. That's not to say that all Muslim people or African people or Afro-Caribbean people are homophobic. They're not. But the rates of homophobia are higher, and the consequences for young people and older people who are LGBT plus in those communities is much higher than the national average. So we need to realize that not everyone can so easily come out. Just a week or so ago, I, with a group of LGBT plus Muslims, leafleted Central London Mosque in Regent's Park, trying to encourage a dialogue and solidarity between the gay and Muslim communities, but also to challenge Muslim homophobia and to support LGBT plus Muslims. It's very interesting that a lot of Muslims claim that they're anti-gay because it says so in the Quran. In fact, that's not true. The Quran does not explicitly condemn homosexuality. In fact, the word homosexuality is not even mentioned in the Quran. And moreover, the Quran certainly prescribes no punishments. So increasingly, Muslim scholars, as well as LGBT Muslims, are saying, well, look, there is no theological basis in the Quran for Muslims to be anti-LGBT. That this is something that derives from Islamic jurisprudence, from Sharia law, from the hadiths of the Prophet Muhammad, but it's not in the Quran. And of course, the Quran says it is the full, complete word of God. It requires no interpretation and no addition. So we and many LGBT Muslims and some Muslim scholars increasingly say that Muslims should follow the Quran only. That if you're a true Muslim, you follow the Quran, you don't follow anything else. But that's a big debate and it's very controversial. When we raised these points at Central London Mosque, we had very mixed reactions. We had some hostility, we had some support, and even 4 worshippers discreetly came out as gay. Clearly, from the responses we got, there's a big argument, a big debate to still have. But we think it's really important to support LGBT Muslims, who are some of the most vulnerable people in the LGBT community, and indeed some of the most vulnerable people in our society in general. We know from LGBT charities that a very disproportionate number of young LGBT kids who are homeless and destitute are young Muslim and Afro-Caribbean kids who've been thrown out of their homes by their parents who reject their sexuality or gender identity. So the LGBT community is trying to support those people and does support them, gets them rehoused, gives them emotional and psychological support. But we really need to challenge the views, the parental views, that lead to parents treating their kids in that way. Finally, I'll just say that the picture in the UK is vastly better than it was, even though there are still these issues to resolve. Globally speaking, however, there are 70 countries that still have a total prohibition on same-sex relations. Homosexuality is against the law. It's a serious criminal offence in 70 countries. And nearly half of those criminalise both male and female homosexuality. In 10 Muslim majority countries, there is still the death penalty for same-sex relations. The death penalty. In the 21st century, the death penalty for same-sex relations. In the other countries, penalties range from a few years imprisonment right up to life imprisonment. I guess you're all familiar with the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth Summit was in London in April this year. Of the Commonwealth countries, 35 still criminalise same-sex relations. This is despite the fact the Commonwealth has a human rights charter, or a charter that includes human rights, and which pledges equality and non-discrimination for all Commonwealth citizens. Yet 35 out of the 53 member states of the Commonwealth criminalise same-sex relations. In 7 or 8 of those countries, there is still the maximum penalty of life imprisonment. And in parts of Pakistan and Nigeria, gay people can be put to death under Sharia law. So quite clearly, on a global scale, the battle for LGBT plus rights has got a long, long, long way to go. But having said that, in the last 40 years, over 30 countries have decriminalised same-sex relations. Most recently, India, the courts there ruled against the colonial era law imposed by the British in the 19th century. They declared that was unlawful, unconstitutional, contrary to human rights. So now, in India, same-sex relations are lawful. And that is a great liberation, because nearly 20% of the world's LGBT plus people live in India. So that single act was the most significant LGBT law reform in the last 100 years. It really has liberated a vast, vast number of people. Similar court actions also struck down the anti-gay laws in Trinidad and Tobago, in Belize, and in many other countries. So there is progress all across the globe, sometimes in the most unlikely countries. But that is good news. That is good news because despite the work that still needs to be done, we are making progress. And my view is that queer freedom is an unstoppable global trend, but we can only make sure it is unstoppable if we fight to make sure it happens. Thank you.